On the morning of 9/11, I was in my room and combination office, and next door to me was a TV room, and one of the staff members came up and said a plane has crashed into the Trade Center. And so I just went in to look at it, and then kind of there stunned, just seemed unbelievable. Then the second plane hit, and anyway, it was just a total shock. So what I did was I said, what can I do that could be of some help? That there's no reason for me trying to go down there. So I went to St. Vincent's Hospital and Medical Center on West 12th Street, where really almost all of the people who were brought from the 9/11 site for medical help, where they were brought and came. And later I was chaplain at St. Vincent's Hospital. But I went there that day and just said, how can I help? And I was told that what would be really helpful is that the people who were processed who needed medical help, that after they were processed, that I would be with them and try and connect with their families, and to try to get them home in some way or another. Now, everything was closed, bridges and tunnels and everything. So I was with several people at St. Vincent's Hospital that morning and that afternoon, trying to connect them to go home. Some were firefighters, and some were folk who worked in the building. And I'm in contact with at least still two of those people. And so then I was there all day, and but in the afternoon, around 2:30 or 3, there wasn't as many people. And I ended up still working, but a little slower. And I left at 5 o'clock because I had to come back to St. Francis, walk back to St. Francis on 31st Street, because I had an hour of the Sacrament of Reconciliation, or what's known as confession, in the church. So I started to walk back, and as I came out of the emergency room of St. Vincent's, I had to go all the way around this. There were well over 100 medical professionals, all in their scrubs, with gurneys, with stretchers, waiting. And so I went out and around in front of them and walked up to 31st Street. And like myself in the waiting room inside, the processing room, everyone was standing and waiting for the people that never came, because everyone was either vaporized, pulverized, or cremated. When the 110 stories came down, both of them in less than 12 seconds, killing almost 3,000 people that day. And so as I walked around, and again, all those medical professionals were standing in the streets and everything, and no one came. Because the people who did come were the people who were sort of ahead of what I'd call, the debris cloud that followed people and often enveloped them. And many of them got through that, but they came and they were just totally covered with the dust. And the 110 stories had all come down into 15 stories of debris. And each of the stories, when I was in the recovery process for 7 months afterwards as chaplain of the fire department, and I was down in the pit raking and with the firefighters and on the pile, that the stories that collapsed, they were all about 18 inches in the final debris. And so there were 7 stories underneath, which was the parking lots, and then 5 stories of debris above that just was totally full with those 16 acres of the trade center and everything around. So I walked, as I had been in the hospital, I kept asking for Mychal Judge, the firefighters that were in, had they seen anything or had they heard anything? And I had no word, but I knew he had gone there, that morning. And because we lived there on the same floor. And I knew he went out, but I didn't know what it was for. So anyway, I was coming back to come to the Franciscan fraternity and the church for my 5:30 shift. And I stopped at the firehouse across the street, Engine 1, Ladder 24 from St. Francis of Assisi Fraternity and Church. And I said, "Have you heard anything from Mychal?" And the firefighter simply said, "I'm sorry, but his body is in the back of the firehouse." And so, so I went into the firehouse, and his body was in a body bag. And for a sense of reverence, the firefighters had hung up sheets in a certain area around, where his body was. And so I stayed with him for about an hour. And I was the only one there at the time. And then after a little over an hour, the Franciscan brothers came from across the street, and the firefighters in the house that had come back and that had survived, because Mychal was one of 5 who died from that house, that firehouse. And so we came together as the ambulance was pulling in to take his body. What had happened was he was one of the first ones found, and his body was carried out by different firefighters and different people. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. But there's that famous picture, it's called the modern day Pietà, where 5 men are carrying out in a chair his dead body. And he was one of the only ones who got out who was recognizable, viewable, and whose body was intact. He was one of the only ones that I know of who had an open coffin, an open casket. He had blunt force trauma in the back of his head. But so anyway, I waited there with the friars, and we said a prayer, and we sing a traditional blessing of St. Francis and Clare. And we sang that for him. When they brought his body out, it was brought to 3 different places, and it ended up on the altar. He was laid out on the altar in front of, with his badge and with his helmet and stole on him. And it wasn't anyway. And interesting, right behind that is behind the altar, below where his body was laid, is a bas-relief of Jesus being laid in the tomb after his death, and there was Mychal ready to be taken. But because he was carried out, his body was carried out, that's why he was intact. And then the 5 of them carrying out his body saved them from the second collapse, not the second collapse, but yes, it was, no, it was, yeah, but anyway, saved their lives to not be in the debris. So anyway, one of us, his classmate, Father Patrick Fitzgerald, he accompanied his body to the morgue. And at the time, the only other bodies in the morgue were Chief Gansey, chief of the fire department, and our first commissioner, Bill Feehan, and then of both of whom Mychal was very close to, and then his was the third body that was there in the New York morgue. So what happened was then I kind of stayed with the firefighters, and their families, of course, were coming or calling. And so I was sort of on the phone in the firehouse, just trying to answer calls from family members and people trying to find out were, the 343 that were lost. Was there any word about any of them? And so I was receiving those phone calls and trying to be present to the families. I went back about midnight and to across the street to the Franciscan fraternity. And then there was a knock on the door from two of the lieutenants from across the street. They had found the bodies of Mychal Weinberg and of Captain Danny Breckel, who went down. Breckel had driven Mychal down in Mychal's car, and the two of them, when the buildings were collapsed, Danny and Mychal hid under a ladder truck, which then was crushed with debris from the collapse, and they were underneath. And so I went with them through the night to go to the families to do the announcement of their death. And it was more really in the middle of the night. And so I know particularly when I went to Morty and Mary Weinberg, who were Mychal's parents. Mychal was this storied firefighter who was a model, who was absolutely stunning. He's a great baseball player. So we arrived, and they saw when the car pulled up, with the rest of the family and friends, they knew something was up. And then we went in the house and told them that Mychal's body had been found. Again, even Mychal and Danny Brethel, while they were crushed under the truck, at least their bodies were recovered, in some form. I had a week earlier been at the Trade Center with my dear friend Carol LaPlante, and visit her in her office. She worked for Marsh McClellan, and the plane impacted at her desk. And anyway, I had been with Carol the day before, a beautiful woman who herself had been homeless at one point in her life. And we had at St. Francis a wonderful outreach to the homeless, and she was part of us establishing not only a literary journal for the homeless folk to write their poems, their short stories, to publish their music, but we also made the lobby of St. Francis Church an art gallery for the art of the homeless of the city, of which Carol had been a major part of pulling together with Alice Gazar, who was a professor at FIT. So anyway, I was then, in touch with Carol. Wasn't to be found. The following April, they found a sliver of her bone, which was even a miracle given the fact that the plane impacted at her desk. But anyway, so I was through the night with the Weinbergs and had been in touch with the Brethels, and there were others who had died in the house. So then that was really it through the night, beginning in the morning and through the night. So that's really the story of my day with it. What ended up happening then was I was really more attending the funerals. Mychal's funeral was the first one really to be had. It happened on Tuesday the 11th, and he was buried on Saturday the 15th at St. Francis of Assisi. And we were celebrating our 100th anniversary as a Franciscan province on the East Coast that day, but of course, everything was canceled. And but anyway, Mychal also died on the 23rd anniversary of his sobriety, and he was a person who brought me, as we would say, into the rooms, finding sobriety as well myself, 22 years ago, a day at a time. So Mychal and Jerry Ward, brought me to that wonderful moment for myself, which anyway. So I was in touch, of course, with fellow persons in the, who were in recovery, who were also close friends of Mychal and of mine. So I spent that through the night and into the next day. And with his two sisters. He has a twin sister who's still alive. She's 88. She's in a memory unit in Texas. Dimphna Judge Jessic, and then his sister Erin. Erin, and she was widowed. They were both widowed at the time. And so I was also in touch with them and making arrangements for them to come to New York for Mychal's funeral. And it was broadcast through through some of the brothers related to the fire department, and Brian Mulheron particularly. It was arranged that that CNN internationally broadcast Mychal's funeral, which was really the first time the world and the country and the city could mourn, so to speak, with the burial of the first person that day, being Mychal Judge. So he became somewhat of an icon. He is an icon in many ways. That picture of him being carried out, and the story that he was the first to kind of go to the fullness of God's kingdom, welcoming everyone else. The other 342, they have cartoons of him in heaven, and all these firefighters and people are coming up the ladders, so to speak, and he's there to welcome them. So it's then I spent the first days afterwards. There was a promotion of about almost 300 officers in the fire department. The leadership and thousands of years of fire department experience died that day with the 342, and so it was being in touch with their widows. There were 800 children who lost in the fire department alone, some of whom had not even been born yet, such as Aiden. Anyway, and several of the students are here. I'm at the College of Mount St. Vincent, living in the dorms with the students for 10 years. I'm here with a group of Franciscan brothers. We live with, they keep us young, but several of the students here are children who lost their fathers in 9/11. and many of them had not even been born. Their mothers were pregnant at the time of their dad's death. So there's many, strains with it. We had Mychal's funeral. Hillary Clinton had given a eulogy, among others. Father Mychal Duffy had preached an exquisite homily. It was considered one of the best of the decades, honoring Mychal. And so, and the day before, so that's at least with myself. So, we had his funeral, but I wasn't at his funeral because my niece got married that day out in New Jersey. I was able to come back in to see his sisters because the bridges and tunnels opened that Saturday morning, but I really wasn't at his funeral. He was to have been at my niece and my nephews, Teresa and Mychal and Teresa Spinner Pelham. They had all come from Philadelphia for their wedding in North Jersey, and that Saturday we were in a Hilton hotel in New Jersey, in the top floor, watching everything burn across the river, type thing. So yeah, and then I was just, there's a whole thing of going to wakes and funerals, and then eventually I was called to be a chaplain in the fire department, in essence, to take Mike's spot. And I had submitted an interview that was requested. We were all trying to say, what could we do with, what could we do to help in all of this? And however, as it approached, there were about 20 people that were, pushing that, I'd be the one that was chosen, and, by the mayor. And I got to a certain point, even though I had the interview, I said, I'm too anxious and afraid to proceed. So I did have the interview with the intention of the courtesy of having it and not thinking of being a chaplain. And then I went back the next day to my staff of Bonnie and Mychal and of Maureen Hess, and I said to them, I'm not going to proceed with this. The four of us were a team working with homeless kids and their mothers in the city, among other things, in what was called St. Francis Cares. So I said, I'm too anxious and afraid. And I'd called a lot of these people to say, thanks for your love and support, but I can't proceed with it. And Bonnie and Maureen and Mychal said, oh yes, you're gonna do it. We've decided you're gonna do it. The people, the firefighters need you, and you need to do this. And we're calling you to do it. And so in that moment, the anxiety and fear moved to serenity and peace. And then I knew, in my own words, I knew it was the movement of my spirit in life, of my spiritual life. It was my sense that this is God's will. This is the calling. I'm being called to do this, as the firefighters had done, and also as some of the people who were encouraging that I do it. And I think, just to say this story, because it says everything that really sums up not only that day, but my life in the fire department and what the reality of it is. So when I was finally commissioned, some of the commissions were put off a while. It was like, what would you call it? It was like a wartime appointments. And so I functioned as the chaplain. And after I was commissioned, when we're commissioned, we say, I offer my life to protect the life and property of the people of New York City. And so they called me across the street and wanted me to sit around, wanted to sit around the kitchen table in the firehouse where everything happens. And the lieutenant had said to me, he said, we know that you've given your life for us as our chaplain. What you need to know is that you have 11,000 of us. We know you're ours. Don't you ever forget that every one of us is yours. So whatever you need, you say it, and it will be done. You need a mass mailing done? You need another person in the office because of what you do for us? We'll pay for it. We know you're ours. Don't you ever, ever forget. All 11,000 of us are yours. Now, what person has ever told that? Particularly what guy has ever told that? What man has told that? And, you know, from this image of the macho firefighters, it's the heart of these men and women who say till today, you know, I offer my life to protect the life and property of the people of New York City. And it continues to be an honor now in my 20th year to continue to be their servant as a chaplain.
I wanted to ask you, Father, and I know it's painful, that hour you spent with Mychal. I know it was filled with prayer, but what else went on? Can you share?
I think it was more a sense of shock and being stunned and trying to absorb this. It just seemed surreal that he was gone. I had met Mychal Judge and a Father Ben Taylor, our Afro-American brother who just died, who lives with me. I'd met Mychal and Father Ben when I was 20 years old, 59 years ago. I had a Teamster in the job where Mychal and Ben had their first assignment, and I wasn't even going to church. And Mychal Judge got me in the business. And I'm saying now he gave me the business. He's given me the business. And I guess I was reflecting back on, I have the gift of this past week celebrating my being 50 years as an ordained Franciscan brother priest, you know, as a servant of the Lord's people and ministering with them for the needs of society. And I guess, you know, my first 3 years, I guess I would have thought back, you know, my first 3 years as a young priest, by some series of special spirits and movements, my first 3 years I spent with Mychal Judge as a young priest, as his probie, so to speak. And but I guess it was just more kind of a sense of shock, and I was thinking of his sisters and saying a little prayer to his mother and father, who I knew would be welcoming him, and as he passed from life through death, you know, to new life. And I think, you know, there's a few things that happened. Mychal knew he was going to die, and he shared that with me during the summer. And he said, "The Lord's going to be coming soon," and he said, "Chrissy, if I have to go to the infirmary, I lived out where there was a little bit of a roof garden." He says, "If I have to go to the roof garden, if I have to go to the infirmary, take me out on the roof garden and shoot me first." But he said, I know the Lord is near. And This is a story that's not known at all, but he, in other words, he was ready to let go and to go into the arms of his God. He nearly died 5 years earlier from a botched surgery. They left something in him during the surgery, uh, some gauze or something. Um, and but he knew something was coming. And firefighter Jimmy Cody, who was the senior firefighter across the street, told me that 10 days earlier, when a young probie by the name of Mike Garumba died in a fire, and he was buried, I believe, 12 days before, on, I think it was the 1st of September. Jimmy said he'd gone to Staten Island to pick Mychal up in the cemetery. Now, Mychal had been 10 years the firefighter. You know, he was a leader in the city. He was a close friend of all the politicians. He was supportive of everybody whom he met. And everyone who met him wanted a piece of him, so to speak. He was such a gathering, wonderful, life-giving person. And I'll say this just before I say this about what happened with Mychal Garumba. We'll talk a little later about his last homily the day before. But when Mychal would have arrived home the night before, the night after he would have visited Father Ben Taylor at Create and then would have come home. He had about 25 voicemails. He'd spend the night kind of answering the voicemails, recording who it was, what it was, and he'd either call back or he would do a handwritten note. He had this incredible handwritten correspondence that he did. And so if he happened to have met you, Sherry, and that day, and he asked for your card, you would have gotten a note from him saying how great it was to be able to meet you. And he looked forward to seeing you again. And if there was any way he could be supportive, just know he was there. And he'd come out in the morning with a stack of letters that he'd be putting in the mailbox. Fascinating. And if it was you and John's wedding anniversary, you'd have a call if he witnessed your wedding. Or if he had baptized you, or he called the spouse of the widow or the widower on the day of the husband's death, of the funerals he'd done. It's just fascinating. However, he was very intensely involved in all the tragedies of the city. And so Jimmy Cody said that when he picked Mychal up at the cemetery of him burying this young probie, he said Mychal got in the car and he broke down and he wept and kept saying, "I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore." And Jimmy said he cried all the way home from the cemetery in Staten Island to the firehouse in Midtown Manhattan there at Penn Station. And that he did something I guess he normally didn't. He stayed the rest of the day in the firehouse with the brothers at the time. There weren't sisters, firefighters. Almost, I image it as almost as he was sort of staying in the womb of and the warmth and the security of the brothers in the house. And then Tara Stackpole. So that happened about just 10 days before, and then just 2 days before, Tara and Timmy Stackpole and Mychal were close friends. Timmy was a storied firefighter who had been burned seriously in a fire and should have never gone back to work, but did go back to work. And he told Tara the only thing he couldn't do was run. And so when he was running from the collapse, he didn't make the corner. So Timmy died that day, and so did Mychal. And the two of them that Sunday, 2 days before, had at the Irish Fesh, the Irish festival in Brooklyn, the two of them were awarded the best man of the year. And Tara told me that she said she had never seen either her husband Timmy or Mychal that out of it. Somewhat they were like in another realm or another world, almost as if a premonition of knowing what was happening or coming. But Tara said we couldn't find Mychal at one point. She says, and I went upstairs and I found him and he was crying. And he said, Tara, I can't do this anymore. He says, I can't talk to you about it right now. He said, but I don't know what I'm going to do. He says, I just can't do this anymore. And the Lord solved that 2 days later and bringing him to bringing him to the fullness of shalom, the fullness of the Lord's kingdom. And and he was ready in a way. And so what happened, in those moments, I think I was more stunned. However, what was fascinating is that, there was and there has been an experience of loss and of emptiness. He brought me to the Franciscans. I was first 3 years in his mentorship as a young priest. He brought me, was instrumental with Jerry Ward and Arthur Cardinale in bringing me to the gift of sobriety. And secondly, there are feelings, I'm sure there are feelings about it, but I think eventually what emerged was an immense sense of gratitude that he died as he would have wanted to die, with those whom he loved the most. And he died with the 342 other firefighters and all of those 3,000 people, many of whom he also knew. And so he could have never survived 9/11. He would have been expected to do all those funerals, and people would be leaning on him in a way that he had just reached he had hit a wall in terms of his energy and sort of losing the fire in his belly, for the job, or for the ministry of, being a chaplain, which is one of the worst things that can happen, particularly in the fire department or for any of us, when we lose the fire in our belly for something that's our life. And so I'm just so grateful that he didn't have to face that. And there's this incredible words of his homily the day before his sermon, and that is recorded, where it's almost as if he had a prophetic sense of what was coming down. But I was grateful that he was blessed with the gift of embracing, being embraced by what we Franciscans call sister death, because he knew it was happening. It was time. He had reached a certain point in his life with experiencing an anxiety and a depression with it, and that he just was immobilized, moving toward feeling immobilized, and that that death is often a gift. And in my own heart, I've never said this, but death was a gift to Mychal, given where he was and everything that would have been expected of him. And he said everything that needed to be said in that homily the day before.
Can you tell us about that homily?
Sure. As a matter of fact, I have the words of it. It'll take about 2 minutes.
Okay.
It was a rededication of a firehouse that had been renovated in the Bronx on Prospect Street. And when there's a rededication, we often have a celebration that's, of the dedication, and he had been asked to celebrate the Catholic Eucharist, the Catholic Mass, and it's on film as well. But these were his words to the firefighters and to the house that day. That's the way it is. Good days, bad days, up days, down days, sad days, happy days, but never a boring day on this job. You do what God has called you to do. You show up. You put one foot in front of another. You get on the rig and you go out and you do the job, which is a mystery and a surprise. You have no idea when you get on that rig, no matter how big the call, no matter how small, you have no idea what God is calling you to. But he needs you. He needs me. He needs all of us. The retirees, he needs you. He needs your prayers. He needs you stopping by occasionally to give strength and support and to tell the stories of the old days. We need the house. And to those of you that are working now, keep going. Keep supporting each other. Be kind to each other. Love each other. Work together and do what you did the other night on a job, and the weeks and the months and the years before. And from this house, God's blessings go forth in this community. It's fantastic. What a great people. We love the job. We all do. What a blessing that is. A difficult, difficult job, and God calls you to it. And then he gives you a love for it, so that a difficult job will be well done. Isn't he a wonderful God? Isn't he good to you? To each of you, and to me. Turn to the Lord each day. Put your faith and your trust and your hope and your life in the Lord's hands. And the Lord will take care of you, and you'll have a good life. And this house will be a great, great blessing to this neighborhood and to this city. Amen.
Thank you, Father Chris.
That says it all.
Yeah.
And that's out of, I can't do this anymore. That, he was a person who reached through all of that, but he spoke, to the firefighters that day, to the leadership and the firefighters. This is who you are, and this is who you're called to be. And this isn't a job, it's a calling. And this can never be called a job with all your masculine strength that you have to muster to go into situations where everyone's running out of. You can't forget that it all started by you being drawn to the fire department because of the witness of life of the other firefighters, and that you've offered your life to protect the life of people in New York City. That's your calling. That's our calling. That's the calling of all of us, to protect one another's lives. All of us, particularly now, and what we can't do alone, we can do together. And so that's the spirit and the life, in a sense, of him. And there's so much, so much more to say. I don't know if you can see here in the background, but there's a picture. The picture that's the big picture on the top of the wall is a picture that that the brothers Julian and Jules Naudet, who have Mychal on film in his last minutes, his last hours. They had been two brothers who are French, and this is available. They had been doing a documentary since July on a young probie, Tony, in the firehouse, and that Julian happened to be there that morning when there was a call on the morning of September 11th, and he, with Chief Joe Pfeiffer, who was the first fire officer on the job, they went to a gas leak, and they took care of it, and then they heard this roar, and Julian happened to span up his camera, and it's the only picture of the airplane that went into the first building. Now, so when they responded, they went in, of course, to the Trade Center. They went into the North Tower where Mychal was. And initially, Chief Joe Pfeiffer was sending the firefighters up to the 76 floors. Chief Joe Pfeiffer even sent his own brother Kevin up, who died. Julian was taking pictures of this. So this is a picture up on the top of Mychal just before he died, and below it is a picture of myself celebrating a Sunday morning mass at the pit. Father Brian Jordan and Brother Fryer and myself would celebrate mass on Sunday mornings, and so that's the picture of his face on the last cut of Julian and Jules's documentary, and he was praying his rosary. And I checked this with Mychal Daly, who wrote the Book of Mychal. It's the best. It's the best thing of people who might be interested in his life story. It's called The Book of Mychal: The Surprising Life and the Heroic Death of Father Mychal Judge, by Mychal Daly, D-A-L-Y. Mychal had put the story together that what had happened was, this is Mychal, he's there at the incident command, and he had a great devotion to the rosary that he said every day, and connecting his life with Mary, the mother of Jesus, our mother, who we used to comment on. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is mentioned more in the Quran than she is in the New Testament. And so the firefighter had reported to Mychal Daly that Mychal was on the mezzanine level, I believe it was, and he was standing at the window, and the bodies were coming down, and the firefighter was with him when a body came down right in front of him at the window and exploded. And it seems that trying to trace his path, that he heard the roar, he ran to go down the escalators, but the debris from the South Tower was coming through the open windows of the North Tower, and it was debris coming through like a train wreck, and And so anyway, he was blown down the escalators, and um, uh, Chief Pete Hayden was with Julian, who was filming at the time, and they had gone into the escalators when they heard the roar. And so they were protected from the debris blowing through the lobby, killing everybody. And so his film is still running. And he said, the only light we had was on my camera. And you can hear them in the background saying, so he had just taken this of Mychal, or shortly before. And he said, Chief Hayden, you can hear him saying, is everyone all right? And they all were. And then all of a sudden they felt something at their feet, and it was Mychal's body. And he was, of course, gone. And so Julian has on the film, he said it was like looking down the glass darkly. It's all clouded. You really can't see anything. You can see after a little bit them carrying out Mychal's body. And in the tradition of the fire department, as well as in the military, you never leave anyone behind. And so they carried him out and brought him to one place. And then another group of 5 firefighters, they weren't 5 firefighters, it was a group of men who were police, who were fire, who were for Office of Emergency Management, and a businessman who had been who had gone to West Point and had served in the Army. They were Mike Stellman and Chris Waugh, and Kevin Allen, John McGuire, and then Shannon Stapleton took that famous picture, the modern pietà, of them carrying him out, and then they put his body down right at the corner there of the cemetery behind St. Paul's Church. And the second building was about to come down, the North Tower. And so they put cones on his body, and they left him there, and then they kind of, ran for their own lives. Who it was this, forgive me, they just brought him there. And then there was a young rookie cop, a beautiful human being. He's now, I know, at least a lieutenant, Jose Rodriguez. And he and Billy Cosgrove, who was a police officer from the precinct in the next block to us, who knew Mychal, Billy Cosgrove came across then Mychal's body, and Jose was there. And Billy said, this is a priest, let's get him his last rites, go to the church on the corner of St. Peter's, where his body was eventually brought. Go to St. Peter's and get a priest to come and anoint him. And so Jose went, and there was a woman tearing up cloths for the use of the moment, and particularly people needing masks with the debris. And he said to her, I need a priest to give this priest his anointing, his last rites. And she says, well, all the priests are gone out of here. She says, they're all out there. And she said, do you happen to be a Catholic? And Jose said, yes, I am. She says, well, you anoint him. So he went back to Jose Rodriguez went back to Billy Cosgrove, and they both held him, and they prayed over him, and then it was the two of them that placed the traffic cones on his body so he could be found after the second collapse, and then they had to run before that collapse killed them. And then his body was brought up to the corner into a lobby of the telephone company, and then another group brought his body to St. Peter's Church, where he was laid out, on the altar two of our friars, Ed and Peter, went down to try and claim his body. His doctor, who's this magnificent woman, Dr. Carrie Kelly, who headed the medical unit of the fire department all through and after that until for 18 years after 9/11. She was also his doctor, but she didn't want to release an ambulance to carry his body up to the firehouse across from St. Francis in case someone needed it. And eventually she did allow an ambulance to transport him. And then that's how his body came to the firehouse. And then I was spending that hour with him before he was brought to the morgue. And what's interesting is his death certificate is 00001 in this homicide of 3,000 in 9/11 in New York City.
Father, is there anything else you want to add?
If you don't mind, I would like to add a statement of our minister provincial about Mychal after he died. It'd take me about 3 minutes. It's a beautiful statement and mirroring back to us from his brothers, who he was and what he meant to us. And we knew that he was our brother friar whose mission was the whole city of New York. And so I'd like to read that, but I'd also like to just add a few things. That the book of Mychal by Mychal Judge is a great resource for anyone who wants to explore that more fully. And his name is spelled Mychal, Mychal. And this is his last homily, the actual taping of his last homily that you get through mychalsmessage.org, it's an 11-year-old who founded this outreach 20 years ago to the homeless in the city on the streets, as Mychal did and as I do. The other thing I think was that Julian Jules Naudet, Naudet, their filming of this part of the collapse, is something that's also available. But I'd just like maybe to read this statement from our minister provincial, John Felice, and later John O'Connor, who was himself a firefighter, and now our Kevin Mullen, a dear friend of his. And let me just say this first. I know it's Black History Month. Mychal, the day before he died, after the homily, went to create in Harlem. And our Franciscan brother and his dear friend and classmate, Father Benedict Taylor, who just died here recently, he lived with me here for 3 years with the brothers. He would have stopped to see Ben at Create Inc. in Harlem, where he was president of the board of trustees there, board of directors of Create Inc., INC, which had 7 programs. Mychal was involved in this outreach with Ben as a colleague. Ben gave his life over, Benedict Taylor gave his life over 53 years ago. He went to Harlem, gave his life for families and their challenges with unemployment, homelessness, addiction, and hunger. And out of that founded 7 programs to respond to the needs of family members, from children all the way through to seniors. And 6 of the 7 programs still exist 45 years later. But Mychal would have stopped, he did stop at Create on the day after the homily. And that was also, he was very much committed to the poor and to the homeless on the streets. We'd go to recovery meetings, and I also work with homeless on the streets as well, to this day. And, he'd know everybody on the street. And I was with him at a meeting one night. And that morning, he had been in the I asked him, how's your day? Oh, well, I was in the White House this morning at a breakfast that Bill Clinton and Hillary had for clergy throughout the country. And I was at Hillary's table. And he says, yeah, he says, I had her sign the program. He says, so he took out the program and signed it. And I said, oh, really? What are you going to do with that? He says, well, I'm going to give it to, he was going to give it to one of the workers. Anyway, but he was in Washington, and it was anyways, in Washington, it was 1999, December 99. And it was toward the new millennium. And Bill Clinton was trying to express the fact of, what he himself had come to learn from the experiences that he had with the impeachment and the nature of it. And he said, does anyone have anything to say? And Mychal stood up and said, he said, all of us here in this country and the world have two people to thank for this last century and as we move into the next. And it's two people who have saved millions of lives and will continue to do so. And that's Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, who founded Alcoholics Anonymous and all the 12-step programs that came out of it. So he's at the White House in the morning. We're back for dinner, going to a meeting, and going to the meeting and coming back. We're meeting all our folk on the street. We have a bread line for 90 years at St. Francis every morning, where we give out nutritional hero sandwiches to over 300, 400 people a day since the crash in 1929, and also have a pantry with it. Franciscans deliver. So young people in the business world would send him stacks of $5 bills. And so we'd go through the streets and talk with folk, and he'd say, do you mind if I share this with you? I got it today from someone, and with dignity, he'd just ask, can I share this with you? And he'd give them, $5. So that's the kind of, and then we go home, and then he'd be listening to the voicemails, returning the calls, and writing the letters. That was his. And anyone who's listening here, if you had given him your address, you'd have had a letter from him. So now what you can do instead is just say a prayer to him and say, hey, Mychal, you're in my memory and my heart, and I'll use your good energy. And so I'll just mention that, and then I'll conclude with this. And then I'll conclude with these words from our minister provincial at the time, John Felice. And then I'll conclude with the blessing that we friars sang with the firefighters when his body was brought from the firehouse to the morgue, where he was death certificate 00001 of 3,000 who died in 9/11 that day. And John Felice had said these words here. Although that tragic event took the lives of almost 3,000 people at the World Trade Center that terrible morning of September 11th, Mychal became the symbol of our grief as a city and as a nation. His selfless act brought meaning and dignity in the face of incomprehensible destruction on that day. His actions and those of his beloved firefighters, as well as the police and emergency service workers, gave us something to be proud of at one of our darkest moments. Their stories tug at our hearts to this very day. Mychal died a heroic death, a cruel fate of time and place. Mychal did not die a heroic death, a cruel fate of time and place, but rather because he lived a heroic life. He made it a point to say yes far more often to life than no, because he believed that a living God wrote the agenda of his day, not himself. In placing himself second, he honored each person he met by putting them first in his time and attention. And that's why he is remembered so personally by so many and so beloved. Mychal moved comfortable among many constituencies. He was a friar and brother first of all, but we knew we shared him with many others. After his brown outfit, the outfit he loved most of all. After his brown habit, the outfit he loved most of all was the uniform of the firefighters. His affection for them rivaled his love for the friars. But he moved in other circles as well, sometimes with controversy. His empathy for the underdog accepted no boundaries. That was Mychal. There's a rush to canonize Mychal these days, and I think it's a mistake. In making saints out of people, we often shove them away from our experience and place them on a pedestal. He was a very human, flawed, complex person, just like the rest of us. His real legacy to each one of us is that such is the stuff of our greatness. Our limits are largely self-imposed. Our willingness to say yes more than no to the events and people that make up our day teach us the life lesson of putting others first. It's a freeing and joyful way to live. Mychal Judge's life is not summed up by that terrible moment at the foot of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He died doing what he loved, among those he loved, a privilege not often afforded to most of us. It was just one last example of a generous heart that knew no bounds, a generous heart to which all of us are called. And I'd like to just to conclude also saying that Gary Urbanowitz, who is the director of the Fire Department Museum on Spring Street, even before he was the director, he's worked with me for 20 years on developing Mychal Judge Archives, which we're just completing. It has over 500 pieces in it of newspapers, stories, magazines, awards, books. He's had more babies, buildings, and boats named after him than anyone. But we're putting all of that together, and it will be at the Fire Department Museum, available to anyone who wants to explore more of the realities of his life. And it'll be available on our Franciscan website, hnp.org, for holynameprovince.org, HNP. So Mychal's prayer that he wrote, his famous prayer every day, was, Lord, lead me where you want me to go. Let me meet who you want me to meet. Tell me what you want me to say, and get me out of your way. Amen. And this is our Franciscan blessing of Francis and Clare that we sang for Mychal, that Mychal always extended to people, as Francis and Claire did, whom they met and whom they loved, being made in the very image and likeness of God. This was the blessing that we sang. It's from the 6th chapter of the book of Numbers. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May he show his face to you and have mercy. The Lord bless you. The Lord keep you. May he turn to you his countenance and give you peace. The Lord bless you. Amen. Shalom.
Amen and shalom. Thank you so much, Father Chris.